Good morning, Mr. Gething. Can you hear me?
Good morning. Should I call you Sir Brian, or what would you prefer?
Well, anything that's reasonably polite will be fine. You're talking to us from Wales, I imagine. Whereabouts?
Indeed. I'm in Cardiff, so not very far from where I live.
Right, and in an office on your own with the technician, perhaps?
Yeah, the technician's in a room next door, so I'm in Geldard's office, but there's no one else here with me. I'm surrounded by green screens that look much prettier on your screen, and there's a technician next door in case anything goes wrong.
Good. Now, let me tell you who you're talking to. You're talking to a reasonable-sized audience today. It's larger than we've had for the other two health ministers. There are, however, many more people beyond the four walls of this room in Fleetbank House who will be watching remotely. Mainly, I suspect, in the case of today's evidence, from Wales, but certainly also, I would imagine, from Northern Ireland, from Scotland, and all parts of England. So that would be a number of somewhere between 100 and 150, most probably. There are representatives of the press, so you've got quite a wide audience. Ms. Richards will be asking you the questions once you've been sworn, and I'll ask Mary to invite you to take the oath.
Please state your full name.
My name is Vaughan Gething.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely.
I do solemnly, sincerely.
And truly declare and affirm.
I do truly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
The evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Good morning, Mr. Gething. Can you see and hear me?
Yes, I can see and hear you fine. Thank you.
You've been a member of the Senate since 2011, is that right?
That's correct.
Between September 2014 and May 2016, you were the Deputy Minister for Health.
Correct.
And then you were the Minister for Health and Social Services from May 2016 until last week.
That's correct, although you'll see in the documents the title has changed at various points in time. It's called Cabinet Secretary for Health and Other Matters, but it's essentially the Cabinet Minister for Health through the whole of the last Senate term, yes.
And you are now, as of last week, the Minister for the Economy in the Cabinet.
Correct.
Can you just assist us with how responsibilities as between the Deputy Minister and the Minister are organised, broadly speaking?
So the Minister, the Cabinet Minister, maintains full responsibility for the whole department. So during the time that I was the Deputy Minister for Health, I was responsible to the Cabinet Minister, who is now the First Minister, Mark Drakeford. My particular focus was on NHS performance, so I didn't have active choices to make around our response to supporting people with infected blood. But since I became the Cabinet Minister in May 2016, a responsibility of the whole department, then I've been essentially the responsible minister within the government.
When you took up that position as the Cabinet Minister, or Minister for Health and Social Services in May 2016, at that point, what, if anything, did you know and understand about the suffering experienced by those who'd been infected with HIV and hepatitis C and the suffering experienced by their families?
Well, I was aware generally of the contaminated blood scandal because there had been not just publicity in various parliaments, but also some of the media reporting, and in particular some of the challenges about how infected blood use came into the National Health Service over a number of years, and the challenges that a number of campaigners had gone through to get some form of recognition. Much of this was as a child and a teenager growing up, of course, because I recognise a scheme set up, I think, in 1988 when I was 14. So it's largely been through public work, but also I have constituents who came to see me in my constituency role who have also been affected. So I have had some of that direct contact, both with improvements in treatment for hepatitis, as well as some, but not all, of the challenges that people have faced in trying to get to this point where there's a much wider recognition, not just of the harm and the suffering, but actually to do something rather more comprehensive in recognition and support moving forward.
And how has your knowledge and understanding of their experiences and their suffering changed or deepened during the 5 years that you were minister?
It's changed significantly, partly because of the continuing contact with constituents, but largely because of having responsibility for the role and actually having to understand much more fully how we got to this point, and also because of the devolution of responsibility for the support schemes, the move from the old Alliance House to then each devolved government being responsible for a support scheme. And in the direct conversations that I've then had, not just with officials, but with representative groups, in particular the Haemophilia Wales group, and the very clear sense of grievance and anger that people had about what was done to them by a significant failing of the state, and about the fact that it still hadn't been resolved. And I understand, and I think, it's undeniable that people have good reason to be angry and upset about what had happened, and the fact they were still having to argue and fight their case. And then, as the responsible minister, having to make some choices about what to do. So I have a much better understanding, but I don't think I should try to tell the inquiry that I fully understand, because I haven't had to live that life of either losing a loved one or caring for loved ones and recognising that this isn't about any fault or blame attaching to me or the person I'm caring for. And I haven't had to see people leave us too soon. So I have an understanding, but it's not the same as people who have actually had to live this.
I'm going to ask you about some of the decisions that you've made during your time in office as Minister for Health. I want to pick it up with a statement from October 2016. Shomit, could we have WIBS 5054, please? So you'll see, Mr. Gething, this is a written statement entitled Wales Reform of Financial Support for Those Affected by NHS-Supplied Contaminated Blood, dated the 6th of October 2016, and it's a statement from you in your role as Cabinet Secretary for Health. It says this: for those affected directly or indirectly by NHS-supplied contaminated blood, I want to end any uncertainty about the level of financial support they will receive from the Welsh Government in the future. The scheme to support payment was established on a UK-wide basis. However, this is now fragmented through new schemes announced for Scotland and England. And then you set out some aspirations in terms of reform. Reform in Wales must ensure that individuals are not disadvantaged in comparison with current arrangements. Decisions take account of views expressed by those affected and their representative bodies. Any move to a new system is equitable and operates transparently, and improvements are affordable and sustainable within the health budget. And then if we go over the page, we see you say in the first paragraph at the top of the page, as a first step to reforming the scheme in Wales, I've taken account of the views expressed by those affected and their representative bodies and the need for administrative efficiency. I've therefore decided that as an interim measure, payments for the remainder of the 2016-17 financial year will be at the same levels as England. And then you set out in the next paragraph arrangements for seeking views on a new scheme by means of a survey and consultation through workshops and so on. If we just go back to the first page, I wanted to ask you about what you said in the second paragraph there. You referred to the scheme having been established on a UK-wide basis and that having now fragmented through new schemes announced for Scotland and England. Wanted to ask what you meant by fragmented and what the implications were for Wales and for your decision making of the announcements in Scotland and England?
Well, previously, Welsh Government ministers hadn't made decisions on the support schemes because they were I think they're referred to as the Alliance House schemes, a series of schemes that had sprung up. I think there were 5 in total. And they'd been delivered on a UK-wide basis. And then the decision was taken by the UK government that responsibility for support should actually go with whoever has responsibility for health, so the 4 governments within the UK, and that new schemes had by that point been announced in Scotland and England. And so we then had to, the people then living with uncertainty, seeing announcements in Scotland and England, so we would need to set out a scheme in Wales as well. And so as you go through my statement, you'll see the initial choice made to mirror payments in England, which is where most people compare between Wales and England. It's a big, not just the land border, but the reality that most of the social and economic links are Wales-England rather than Wales-Scotland. And it's then about trying to then have an engagement with people who have been scheme beneficiaries in the past to understand how we design a support scheme in Wales.
So would it be right then to understand from the perspective of the Welsh Government that this wasn't a matter really of a choice for the Welsh Government to set up its own scheme? It was effectively forced upon, might be a little too strong a verb, but because of the decisions of the UK government and the actions that were being taken to set up an English scheme and a Scottish scheme, you had little choice but effectively to set up a Welsh scheme.
I think that's a fair summary.
And do you know if there'd been, as far as you can recall, any consultation by the UK government with the Welsh Government about this new responsibility that would be potentially thrust upon the Welsh Government?
I think there were conversations between officials, but it's certainly not a matter where the Welsh Government was saying, we desperately want an entirely different scheme in Wales and we want you to give us the responsibility with none of the resources to do so. When the announcement was made, it wasn't a surprise on the day, which does happen from time to time with UK government announcements, but it was a matter of the UK government having made a decision.
I'm going to ask you a little later about issues of funding and funding streams and what avenues of funding there were for the Welsh Government in terms of funding the scheme. But leaving aside for the moment issues of funding, were there any particular constraints or conditions or preconditions from the UK government placed upon the Welsh Government in terms of what the scheme should look like or what its eligibility requirements should be?
No. The reality is we already have a defined group of people who have been beneficiaries of previous schemes. Some of those are organised into groups, some of those don't want to be recognised in partner groups, and they deal with they're dealt with the schemes on an individual basis. So we have a discrete group of people. As to what we then did in terms of the choices we made to support, there wasn't a straitjacket in terms of the UK government saying you may or may not make decisions in these areas. What was really important, though, in terms of any support arrangements was a relationship with the benefit system and to make sure that people's other benefits weren't affected, but those relate to other UK government choices. So as well as the health department in the UK government, there's always been a need to make sure that the Department for Work and Pensions are cited and not going to apply conditions that would mean that other benefits would mean a reduction in the value of the payment, in essence.
And then before we look at the specific decisions that you've taken in relation to the Welsh scheme following this statement, can I just ask in broad terms for your reflections on what the advantages or disadvantages have been from your perspective of there being a Welsh scheme, a devolved scheme?
Well, the disadvantage is you get different schemes in different parts of the UK, and so you then have people asking, well, am I better off in one scheme or another? The advantage is the exact mirror, which is that the exact converse, which is that you get to reflect what beneficiaries you're responsible for actually want. The challenge is in all of this, it was a whole UK failure, a system-wide failure over many decades. And you may have a challenge about which scheme is looking after you, and is it an accident where you live, not necessarily where you're infected, and is that fair? So that's a challenge to work through, and I know we're going to talk about parity later. But in the discussions we had, it meant we were able to listen to what people wanted to do and what we then could do. So that's why we introduced the psychological support elements, because that was a view that came up in the consultation we had with the scheme beneficiaries that we are responsible for in designing and implementing the Welsh scheme.
Now, I'll come on to the psychological support at a slightly later stage. If we look at your next announcement, and this is the announcement of the scheme itself, which is at CVHB 5040. And we can see it's a statement by you on behalf of the Welsh Government, 30th of March 2017. I'm pleased today to inform members of new support arrangements for individuals and their families affected by hepatitis C and HIV through treatment with contaminated blood in Wales. These arrangements will come into effect in the coming year and be administered through a new process I expect to become operational in October. The significant impact on many individual lives of such infections has been extensively discussed in the Assembly Chamber, with broad agreement that we must improve the ex gratia support provided by Welsh Government. I announced significant new investment that enabled us to mirror English arrangements on an interim basis during 2016-17, but most importantly was committed to taking into account the views of those affected to ensure that going forward this support is used to best effect and our arrangements are transparent and equitable. And then if we just pick it up on the last line of the page, I'm therefore introducing a single streamlined scheme for Wales to be administered by Valenja NHS Trust through the NHS Wales Shared Services Partnership. You refer in the next paragraph to there being an automatic transfer to the new scheme and to working with the Department of Work and Pensions and with HM Revenue and Customs. You refer in the next paragraph to the workshops and survey. And then if we go down towards the bottom of the page, please, Seamus. You say this: 3 principal messages influenced my decisions. The first was that there is a need to provide broader assistance over and above financial support. Affected individuals can experience difficulties accessing healthcare services, home or travel insurance, other financial benefits or suitable public services. Having heard this, I intend our new scheme to include a holistic support service for every affected individual to be provided face-to-face, online and by telephone. I believe this will significantly improve our beneficiaries' sense of security, quality of life and care, and I hope ensure they're treated with the dignity they have a right to expect. I'm just pausing there, Mr. Gething. I won't take you to the scheme documents, but the concept of a holistic support or holistic services is embedded in the actual scheme documents that established the scheme. Why was something beyond financial support regarded by you and the Welsh Government as important, and what in broad terms does the holistic support encompass?
Well, it directly came from the conversations and engagement we had in the consultation period on the new scheme. So we heard in both the events, the one in North Wales, one in South Wales, as well as in the written responses, that finance, of course, was important, but it was more than that. And in particular, the psychological support, but also understanding how to navigate your way around support systems. Now, I think we've done some of this, but it's about understanding the impact on the whole person and in their context. And money doesn't actually necessarily do that. There may be other parts of that person's life that are more important they want assistance for. So some of that's a direct provision, some of it's signposting people to a suitable support service. So that's what we are trying to do, to see the whole person, to understand how we can help support that person in matters that are about more than money. The most obvious part is the psychological support and assistance that we then eventually have provided. But it is about, as I say, that broader support for the individual in their own unique circumstances.
we then move to the bottom of the page, we can see the second of the three principal messages you state. I want to address the concerns raised about access to discretionary funding. This has not been straightforward or equitable in that many never apply at all for these funds, and those who do apply can find it burdensome and undignified to fill in forms to seek often modest amounts of money. As equity is a key value for our new scheme, I've decided to increase all regular payments to include an amount towards additional expenses, such as increased winter fuels, in relation to treatment, travel/overnight accommodation, and insurance, personal/travel. My intention is to remove the need for people to apply for this support, although a small discretionary fund will be retained. Again, Mr. Gething, what was the thinking which led you to identify that as one of your three principal messages?
Well, again, this came from engagement with people directly affected themselves. And some people were applying for discretionary support, but for others, they either didn't understand or didn't want to engage in it for a range of reasons. There's still lots of stigma. And actually, for the amounts of money, the point about burdensome and undignified, that was a very strong response from people. And so actually, rather than saying there's an amount of money that you have to go through an application process for, we decided to do exactly as the statement sets out, to increase regular payments rather than having those individual pots of money. There was recognised that there may be circumstances that we couldn't anticipate for, where a discretionary amount and a discretionary fund might be appropriate. So that's why we retain that. But in all of these different areas, there are increased costs for people. And those costs matter. They may not be hugely significant financial costs in the grand scheme of things, but for those people, there's additional costs for dealing with the reality of the fact that they had infected blood from the NHS. There were things we wanted to try to make some contribution towards on a much more predictable basis, provide equity to the whole group of beneficiaries, in recognising that some people had simply not engaged with the process for reasons that I think are entirely understandable.
And then the third principal message that you set out in this statement was this: finally, I learned that we can do more to support those who've been bereaved, especially during the early years when distress and financial difficulty may be greatest. The one-off payment is not sufficient to help people adjust when regular payments cease. To address this, I've decided that spouses, civil partners or partners will receive 75% of the regular payments for 3 years after bereavement. For the newly bereaved, payments will reflect the regular payment rate at the time of death. For those bereaved in earlier years, the 2016-17 rate will be applied and one payment made in full. Again, Mr. Gething, really same question. What was it that led the Welsh Government to include an element of regular payments? I'll ask you a little more about the detail of it in a moment, but an element of regular payments for the bereaved, or for bereaved spouses and partners?
Well, again, this reflects what we heard in the consultation, also in the meeting that I had with one of the representative groups as well. This was a point that was made strongly to me. The reality that when someone passes away, the one-off payment doesn't necessarily help people to adjust to not having that person. And sometimes that person will have been a financial contributor, but for other people it is simply about managing and dealing with the loss. And again, these are people in a pretty unique set of circumstances where they have been failed. And so actually the element of regular payments was to try to smooth out the challenge and the pain of moving on and not potentially having that financial support. So it's about helping people through a transition after bereavement. Now, in any of these, money doesn't fully reflect the loss, but it is about trying to have something that is as fair as possible. And of course, things have progressed since this time as well.
The Scottish scheme was 100% for the first year and then 75% thereafter. We leave aside for the moment the 100%, 75% difference. When we look at the most recent announcements, I may come back to that. But the Welsh scheme was limited the payments at 75% to 3 years. Was there a logical or or moral or principled basis for that, or was that simply in reality a reflection of financial constraints?
Was part of it trying to understand how long a period of time would it take to help support people through bereavement, getting used to changed financial circumstance. And it was also a reflection that from a budgetary point of view, there is a limit to the budget that we have. And in managing my whole responsibilities, I remember this was a particularly difficult time in trying to reflect a balanced budget. And so there were financial considerations that were part of it. There's no point trying to pretend they weren't. That was part of what we had to manage. And in the earlier point in setting out what we'd be able to do, I'd made the point that we needed to have something sustainable within the health budget. And that's part of the consequence of devolving responsibility for the support schemes to devolve governments away from the UK government.
And is it right to understand from what you said there in the last sentence of that paragraph that there was no cut-off date in terms of the date of bereavement? Someone whose husband, for example, had died 10, 15 years previously would be entitled to apply for this, although what they'd get 75% of would be 75% of the 2016-17 payment rate. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Just one point of detail I've been asked to explore with you. As I understand it, the 75% that the widow or partner receives will, in general terms, be 75% of what the deceased would have been receiving. So widows may get a variable rate depending upon what, and I'm using widows just as an example, what their husband or partner had been entitled to receive by way of payment, which in turn would depend on whether they were, for example, mono-infected, co-infected, hepatitis C, HIV. Is that right?
Yes.
What was the thinking behind differential rates then for widows?
Because it reflects the payments that were actually being made. So, and this always comes back to scheme design, and again, this vexed question of what is fair, bearing in mind there's a huge unfairness that has been imposed on these people with the pain and the suffering they've already gone through. But then once you have ascribed an amount for regular payments that are being provided, it's a percentage of those regular payments. And this is difficult, but it was part of the commentary and the discussions we had about what would and wouldn't be fair. So that's the way we settled an equal portion of the regular payments that would previously have been provided before the bereavement.
In setting up the Welsh scheme, what, if any, consideration was given to the model of financial support used in the Republic of Ireland?
Well, this was something that was mentioned to us on regular occasions, and understandably so, in terms of advocating for the best possible support scheme. The Republic of Ireland scheme was regularly mentioned to us, and it came down to what we were able to do and to achieve. And you have this benchmark of England on the one side and the Republic of Ireland on the other. And of course, the broader healthcare and support systems are different. I have more understanding of the Republic of Ireland's healthcare system than others. My wife is Irish, I have in-laws, but it was really about what can we do. And the Republic of Ireland scheme was more generous on a range of fronts, and we simply weren't able to match that in what we could do. So yes, we are aware of it, yes, we considered it, but actually it wasn't something that we could deliver and be sustainable through the health budget that we had to work with.
And what consideration was given to the Scottish model, or was it a case very much of just looking to the English model and seeking to match elements of that?
No, we looked at the Scottish model as well as the schemes developed, and it's hardly surprising that people will look at what's available in different and especially nearby countries, and starting with those in the UK and the Republic of Ireland being the next most obvious one to look at for reasons that are entirely understandable. And again, it comes down to what can we do and how do we then do that as fairly as possible, given the envelope that you have to operate in as a decision-taking minister. And I know that's quite uncomfortable sometimes, because that doesn't sound like you're just saying, let's do what's right. But actually, you still have to make choices within the financial envelope that's available to you. And that's hard, I know. It's hard as a decision taker, but I also know it's much harder if you're the person who is saying, but it appears to me that there is not just more money, but that gets turned into a greater value being attached to someone in my circumstances in a different part of the United Kingdom. So I understand that in itself has been an ongoing cause of grievance, even though this represented an improvement in the position in Wales. I don't doubt for a single second that people wanted us to have the most generous support system available, and they would have been disappointed that we couldn't match what Scotland.
Why was Valenja NHS Trust chosen as the administrator of the scheme?
Well, there was a very clear view from people who were going to be beneficiaries from the scheme that they wanted a not-for-profit group. They didn't want or like the idea that someone would come in and on a for-profit basis be delivering the scheme. So we chose Valenja as a not-for-profit organisation, and they were able to deliver the scheme through NHS Shared Services. So NHS Shared Services was housed within Valenja NHS Trust, and they were able to deliver the scheme in the time frame that we wanted. And it's also because we're able to, instead of creating a wholly new organisation, we were able to direct Valenja to create this service, and we're able to work with them to do so. And that's part of our ability effectively as in line managing the NHS in Wales to be able to do that.
Now that was your announcement, March 2017, for the scheme that would then begin to operate in the autumn of 2017. Could we next go to WITN 4065002? Now, this is an announcement by you in March 2019. Before we look at the detail of it, is it right to understand that this is really, although there may have been some modest adjustments to the scheme between 2017 and 2019, this was the first major change that was being made to the scheme since its inception?
Yes, that's fair.
If we look at, the second paragraph refers to the acceptance on behalf of the government that beneficiaries of our ex gratia payment scheme delivered through our partners at the Welsh Infected Blood Support Scheme will have experienced significant mental health, well-being and post-traumatic stress associated with their experience of infection. And then it refers to officials having met with those directly affected clinicians, benefits advisors and counsellors at WIBS, to gauge their thoughts regarding additional means of support for all beneficiaries, particularly those at stage 1 with life-impacting complications arising from their hepatitis C infection. And then you say this: following these discussions, I've agreed to make available the following enhanced support. We go over the page, we see you make several announcements, the first of which is enhanced hepatitis C staged 1 scheme payments for those with existing stage 1 hepatitis C who are suffering from mental health symptoms which they consider to be related to their being infected with hepatitis C, and where the mental health symptoms they are experiencing have an effect on their ability to carry out day-to-day activities. The enhanced payment will be equivalent to the current rate of payment for those at stage 2 hepatitis C infection, which is £18,500 per annum, where an application to receive the enhanced Hep C stage 1 plus scheme payment is submitted by 23rd of April 2019. The payment will be backdated to April 1st, 2018, or to the date that the individual first received the stage 1 ex gratia payment under WIBS, whichever is the later. And then if we look towards the bottom of the page, you say the proposed enhanced scheme for those at stage 1 infection will be much simplified from that available across the border, with no requirement for medical input into the application process. Beneficiaries will simply be asked if they're suffering from any mental health symptoms that they feel are related to their infection from contaminated blood or blood products. the symptoms and whether they're affecting their ability to carry out day-to-day activities. If this is the case, there'll be no need for further assessment because the person's already been diagnosed with hepatitis C from infected blood or blood products, and this is already acknowledged as unjust. Now, before we look at the other changes, because this, I think, was the principal change in terms of financial support that you were announcing on this date, the English scheme had introduced in the latter part of 2017, I think, the special category mechanism. Is it right to understand that this was the Welsh Government's equivalent, not the right word, I think, but its alternative to introducing a special category mechanism type payment?
Yes, and again, we weren't as cited as we'd have wanted to be when the special category mechanism was introduced, and every time there's a change in a scheme, there's a ripple effect from people across the UK. We looked and we thought then about what we would want to do, so it was about a need to re-engage with people, how to do this and how to do this in a way that is as fair as possible. So we didn't go down the same route of medical evidence, but it's about the understanding and the conversation with people about the direct impact of their symptoms. So we deliberately went for a more simplified approach, and that's what led to us making this. When I say us, ultimately it's me, I'm the decision maker, so it's my choice. But in conversation with officials and from the engagement they had with our stakeholders.
So would it be right to understand that in broad terms, in terms of what the process was for applying for this, it's more closely related to what we've heard about in Scotland, arising from their clinical review? It's a process of self-declaration by the beneficiary who's making the application, rather than, as under the English scheme, a process which requires analysis and a report and the completion of a form by a clinician setting out hepatic consequences and sequelae of hepatitis C.
Yes, that's fair.
And what you refer here, I think, to it being a simpler process, avoiding the need for further assessment. Were those essentially the reasons for going down this model rather than the clinical model, to try and make it simpler and more straightforward?
Yeah, and again, it's an understanding of the hurt that people have already gone through, and then to be told that we need to essentially put you through another process where you're going to be re-examined and you won't know what the answer to that is before we're prepared to acknowledge that you really are suffering further psychological impact. And the recognition was that in the great majority of cases that you'd end up saying that was the outcome, and why put people through that process. You'd need to have something for people to actually recognise they had those symptoms, to recognise actually, and to be able to say there's something that I feel I'm really impacted by, and that would then be a much simplified conversation, so that self-declaration rather than an external review and support. And of course, you need to remember there's quite a lot of mistrust, where if you're being told that there's going to be an extra medicalised process, that some people think that's just a way of trying to come up with the wrong answer, and essentially that'll be a cost-saving process to avoid making payments. So we had to try to think through all of those different things, then come back, as I've already said at the end of the paragraph you referred to, but what is just the already acknowledged injustice that had already been visited upon these groups of people.
Now, this is an announcement made in March of 2019. If we go to HSSG 0020018, we can see this is a report from the manager of the Welsh Infected Blood Support Scheme a year earlier, 22nd of March 2018. And if we go to page 7, please, Shomik, we can see if we can see under the heading there, potential options re special category mechanism, reference there to the English scheme having adopted the special category mechanism. It says, since England introduced the SCM, we've received a number of queries on whether Wales will follow suit. It's highly likely that WIBS beneficiaries will challenge Welsh Government's policy if a similar approach is not adopted in Wales. And then 3 options are set out: don't adopt, introduce special category mechanism or something similar, do away with stage 1, thereby negating need for special category mechanism. And if we go over the page, I'm not going to go through the detail of the options analysis. If we look at the conclusion on the next page, we can see the recommendation from WIBS is that the Welsh Government adopt the special category mechanism or a similar system. This would ensure our beneficiaries would not be disadvantaged under our scheme compared to those in the English scheme. And then there is an estimate of costs. Now, before I ask you a question, I just want to show you one further document. So that's March 2018. And if we then go to HSSG 002 0006, you'll see, Mr. Gething, there's an exchange of emails here from June 2018 within the Department of Health in Wales. And if we go, or the Health and Social Services Group within Wales, and if we go to the next page, and we just look at the email at the bottom of the page, so this is June 2018, it says there are a few things outstanding which are currently holding us back. The first is the 2018-19 uplift for beneficiary payments, and I'll ask you about the general position of uplifts in a few minutes. And then 2, England has introduced a special category mechanism which in theory provides beneficiaries at stage 1 that have limiting lifestyle factors similar to beneficiaries clinically classed as stage 2 with the stage 2 payment levels. Our paper highlighted some options around this. That, I think, is a reference to the March 2018 paper. Skipping down a couple of lines, the email continues, again, we're receiving regular calls about this. This is also pressing as the majority of our beneficiaries are at stage 1, and if there was a change of policy in Wales, then this could be financially significant to them. Now, bearing in mind these were recommendations being made and then followed up in March and June of 2018, can you help us understand why it was not until March 2019 that the enhanced stage 1 plus payment was introduced?
Yeah, it's a challenge in getting through from the initial recommendation from WIBS, and then when that comes to me as the minister and the dialogue between officials, but also looking to engage with people directly affected. And that's also why this was backdated, because the length of time getting the process right. And part of the challenge in the special category mechanism is it was announced without notice, and so we were then really catching up. And every day you're trying to catch up, there are people who understand me saying, why are we being treated differently? So it's simply about how quickly the machinery of government and consultation can work to understand what do we do. The broad recommendation is there. You then have to find a way to say, well, how do we do this in a way that is fair to operationalise it? And that then comes to me with some choices about sign-off saying, yes, please go ahead and do this, and find a way to do this fairly, and then to sign off and make the announcement on that actual operational way to deliver it. But because the time that it had taken, that's why there was an element of backdating in it as well, to reflect the fact that otherwise, if we'd moved forward from the March, the later date when it was announced, you'd have understood we had people coming and making a representation about the fairness of that. So that was a proactive decision to backdate it to reflect the time taken to deliver the change.
If we then go back to your March 2019 announcement at WITN 40650002 and just pick up the other aspects of that announcement. We go to the 3rd page, please, Shomik. So the second announcement is in the 2nd paragraph on this page. A structured assessment and personalised package of additional assistance will be offered to all those infected and their families as part of the new WIBS psychological support arrangements. The need for such support has also been emphasised through the infected blood inquiry and will form part of the overall package of holistic provision available. So the second aspect of your March 2019 announcement was to introduce a psychological support service. Is that right?
Correct.
And is it right to understand that that was a service available both to those whose route of infection was through blood products as a consequence of treatment for bleeding disorders, and those whose route of infection was through transfusion or treatment with other types of blood disorder, treatment with other types of blood product?
Yes, that's right. It's essentially anyone affected by the matters that the inquiry is running through. So it was really about the psychological impact rather than trying to re-understand the route to the infection taking place, but the consequence of that.
And we see there the reference to families as distinct from, when we look at the financial support payments to the bereaved, the narrower definition of in terms of widows, widowers, civil partners, and so on. The psychological support arrangements are available, are they, to any family members in principle who've been affected?
In principle, shown that they'd been affected, and within that, we didn't think we'd have a mushrooming out of people wanting to get family members who hadn't been affected, because this is so personal, and it's the direct impact and understanding. And whilst there are support groups, those are to support each other. Lots of people don't want to talk about this in public. And so it's actually a challenge to get people to take up the support that's been offered. And that's why the direct conversation and the direct communication with those infected and their families have been important. And the recognition that if you try to limit this to, if you like, the next of kin, that wouldn't necessarily reflect the wider impact of the psychological harm that had been caused.
And then if we look at the next paragraph, it says, in addition to these enhancements, WIBS will adopt a revised and more open and transparent approach to the way the existing discretionary fund is administered. They will write to all beneficiaries, informing them of the eligibility criteria and inviting them to apply. This support will further enhance the lives of those affected in a more regulated and equitable way, and will be available in addition to the existing regular ex gratia and income top-up payments. Now, the suggestion there that there will be a revised and more open and transparent way to the administration of the existing discretionary fund might tend to suggest that there had been problems with the way in which the discretionary fund was operating, and that it wasn't operating at the most desirable level in terms of openness and transparency. Is that correct? And were you aware of there being any particular concerns or problems about the discretionary fund?
My recollection is that we weren't getting lots of people applying and making use of it and understanding what was available in the discretionary fund. This is really about proactively making clear to people the eligibility criteria for all beneficiaries and inviting them to apply, so you don't have an uneven take-up within the fund. And equally, you don't have people frustrated applying through the discretionary fund for something that may or may not be eligible, when actually a greater understanding of the criteria could help to resolve that before it's a problem. This is really about trying to make it work as fairly as possible and making sure everyone's got proper notice so they can make choice about whether they want to apply or not. So it's really about the learning and introducing new parts and understanding how proactive you need to be to make clear the fund's purpose and its eligibility.
Now, if we just go back to the full page and just look at the next paragraph, it says, or you say, I can also confirm that the suite of ex gratia payments currently available to those belonging to WIBS will see their payments rise in line with the cost of living price index, including housing, CPIH, as published in February 2019 from the 1st of April 2019. So that's a cost of living increase to payments. Now, we know from other evidence the inquiry has heard, and indeed will no doubt hear more about tomorrow, that in April 2019, the Department of Health and Social Care announced an increase in the rates of regular payments that were going to be made under the English scheme. Just wanted to ask you a couple of questions in relation to that. First of all, was the Welsh Government, as far as you can recall, informed or told in advance that those increases were going to be made to the English payments?
I don't recall that we had any material notice of the increase that was going to be made in England. That's a cause of frustration, and it inevitably leads to beneficiaries in different parts of the UK saying, what's happening to us? So, no, we didn't have material notice of the change.
And again, without, we've got multiple comparison tables, I think, in the papers, but without going to the tables and going through the specific payments at any one point in time, is this right as a matter of general statement? The Welsh Government did not make a comparable increase, or I think any increase other than the increase announced here, to the regular payments to try and bring them either closer to or in line with the English payments, until we get to the very recent March announcements of this year, which I want to come on to later.
I think sorry, because I think, just correct if I'm wrong, but the payments we're talking about now and the increase was essentially at the first day of the inquiry sitting, and we certainly didn't have notice of that. The frustration was there'd been a meeting between officials, between governments, I think, in the week before, and there wasn't any sharing or conversation about that. In fact, my understanding was that officials had agreed that they'd wait for the inquiry to start to see what came from the evidence before moving. And that we then have been in a position where we haven't made substantive increases until the recently announced parity agreements, and that has largely been about our ability to do so. So yes, that's a position that we have been in, and I recognise that has put those people that we have responsibility for in terms of the Welsh scheme in a different position.
We can take that down. More broadly, Mr. Gething, what's your understanding as effectively the decision maker who established the Welsh scheme as to the rationale for the making of these payments? Why are they made, and what are they designed to reflect?
Well, these are it's the successor scheme to the old Alliance House schemes that came up as we've gone through in an ad hoc way. And in honesty, my understanding is these are support payments to reflect the fact that something had gone wrong, to reflect the harm and the distress, but also really to try to provide some practical support for people. And we get into the position of there being no recognition of formal liability and a desire not to admit liability. I understand why people do that from time to time. I used to be a lawyer in the old days when I had a job that people understood and respected. But the reality is that there's been a long-standing desire not to call these compensation payments. But in reality, they are what many people understand to be something like that. And once you have these ex gratia payments in place with the practical support that they provide, you've got to find a way to deliver them fairly. And I've tried not to get too tied up into whether they are or aren't compensation. I've tried to focus on the practical impact the payments have and how we deliver fairness and support, which is why with some of the changes we've run through in the scheme, it was about more than money. But that's my honest understanding of what's happened. And as I say, I've got an imperfect understanding of how the schemes were put together in the past. I have a much clearer understanding of my role as a decision maker and trying to do the right thing since I became the responsible minister.
In terms of the as well the period during which the Welsh scheme has been in operation, is this right that there has not been by or on behalf of the Welsh government, or indeed I think any of the other governments, any attempt at a structured or comprehensive assessment of the needs of those who were infected and their families, or of the losses experienced by them over many years?
I think there are two answers to that. And I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm trying to say that, in honesty, the way we've tried to understand the needs and the conversations we had about designing the scheme, that was about trying to understand the need and how we best provide support. That's different, though, to the way that if you're running a legal claim, you'd run through and understand rather more acutely and hopefully more accurately the direct impact of the loss suffered and the pain, suffering and financial loss. So we've never tried to do that in the way you would in a claim that I'm familiar with in my time in both personal injury and employment law fields. But we have tried to understand the impact in those broader terms when we've consulted with and listened to people that we have responsibility to support through the Welsh scheme.
And it's right, I think, to say that the Welsh scheme, and again, this is in common with the other national schemes, doesn't purport to compensate for past losses. The regular payments are designed to provide a degree of financial support on an ongoing basis, rather than to account for any type of historic loss.
No, I think that's a fair summary of the position, yes.
Do you consider that there is, in broad terms, on government, and I'm deliberately using the term on government in that general sense rather than any specific national body, a moral responsibility or obligation to address the impacts of what happened?
Yes, and I don't think we'd be having this inquiry if that weren't the case. We wouldn't, if we didn't think there was any moral responsibility or obligation to act in Wales, well, we wouldn't have spent the money in the scheme in the way that we did. We recognise that there is moral responsibility, and I hope that at the end of this inquiry we'll have a clear understanding not of what happened, but actually what's going to take place in the future. Because every year there are fewer people to make the case and to remind people of what's been done to them.
Can I ask you to look now, just I think to assist with some general questions about some of the funding constraints, at a statement from Chris Jones, Shomik, it's WITN 4065004. So you'll see there, this is a statement of Dr. Chris Jones on behalf of the Welsh Government. And can you just tell us what Dr. Jones's position is within the Welsh Government?
Dr. Chris Jones is the Deputy Chief Medical Officer for Wales.
Now, if we go to the third page of the statement, Dr. Jones has helpfully set out some matters in relation to the funding arrangements. So if we pick it up towards the bottom of the page under the heading Funding for the scheme, the budget allocated to WIBS is considered as part of the annual budget setting process of the Welsh Government. Forecast of expected costs are received regularly from WIBS with specific revisions where any change in policy is being proposed. This will include an estimate of costs in relation to HIV cases, which can be taken into account when setting the Welsh Government budget for WIBS. The additional budget for the HIV cases is transferred to Wales at the second supplementary budget each year, and Dr. Jones has defined that. This is because it was recognised that no funding flow to Wales had taken place in relation to historical HIV cases. And then if we go down to paragraph 6, we can see Dr. Jones says, in terms of the ongoing annual process for the transfer of HIV funding, it would be desirable that this arrangement is regularised and that Wales receives a permanent transfer of funding. Funding levels for WIBS are reviewed annually and during the financial year if required. And then paragraph 80 says the levels of regular payments and lump sums were initially set in 2016-17 after consideration of the Scottish and English schemes, coupled with wider consideration of overall affordability. And then he refers to the engagement process. And then if we go over the page, paragraph 9, he explains how regular payments are increased by the Consumer Price Index to take account of inflation, refers to the stage 1 plus hepatitis C category, and then says this: Welsh Government has not matched the increase in ex gratia payments announced by the UK Government on the opening day of the infected blood inquiry in 2019. Then talks about the parity issue, which we'll come on to later. And then paragraph 10 says, prior to the parity announcement on the 25th of March 2021, Welsh Government had received many representations in the form of correspondence both from beneficiaries, their families and Senedd members. Whilst all correspondence is given due consideration, the fact remained that Welsh Government were unable to meet the financial implications of these requests. And then paragraph 11, there is no ongoing minimum funding commitment by the UK government or DHSC towards the Welsh Government's funding for WIBs. It would be preferable if a permanent budget transfer to Welsh Government from 2021-22 onwards could be agreed with the UK Government. And then at paragraph 13, he says, moving away from in-year budget transfers and time-limited proposals from the UK Government would ensure there is continuity and security for the levels of payments required to achieve parity across all 4 nations. And then, sorry, just over the page, just to complete it. There is an annual commitment for DHSC to provide funding to cover the costs of payments made to those who were infected with HIV. This has arisen as there's been no permanent transfer of funding made to Wales to cover the costs of those with HIV, unlike the arrangement made under the old schemes for those infected with hepatitis. So with that by way of background and explanation, just a handful of questions or clarification I wanted to ask you about. In terms of the HIV funding then, we see from this, and in common with what we've learnt from the witnesses over the last 2 days in relation to Northern Ireland and Scotland, that the Department for Health and Social Care provides funding directly to the Welsh Government, which is designed to cover or reflect HIV payments. Is that right?
Yes, that's the theory of what's supposed to happen, and it's done on an annual basis.
And when you say that's the theory of what's supposed to happen, why do you use that description?
Well, because there is a budget transfer that's earmarked in that way, but as we've discussed, there's been a shift and movement in payments. And so that's why I think getting to more broader parity is really important. And then it's about whether it's clearly identified as a financial transfer on agreed rates. Otherwise, you're getting into a transfer is made for this purpose, but if all the schemes shift and change, then that changes the nature of the payments being made. It's not fully covering the costs of going out in the scheme, and you're then taking money from other parts of each relevant government's health budget to do so. That's why I think clarity on this and a longer term commitment is desirable, as Dr. Jones sets out in his statement.
So is this right? And again, it may reflect the evidence we've heard in relation to other parts of the United Kingdom. The payment is made by DHSC, but you don't necessarily know what precisely that payment's going to be well in advance, and you don't have a long-term commitment to the continuity of that payment. Is that right?
That's correct.
And do you know, if you can't assist us with this, please do say so, but do you know how the DHSC calculates the HIV payment that it makes to the Welsh Government?
No, I don't. I'd be making it up if I told her that I could tell you how the calculations are arrived at.
Don't worry, I think we've got documentation that assists, and if not, we can ask further questions in writing. So is it right to understand from Dr. Jones' statement and from your own knowledge that currently there is no ongoing commitment from the Department of Health and Social Care, from the UK government, to the future of the HIV element of the funding?
That's correct. So we have this annual process, but there's no that's set out in any way that be enforceable or practically or morally that payment will continue. It's happened year to year, but we've seen that changes have been made previously in one-off budget transfers, and then the responsibility has been passport in a range of other areas. So on this, I say it would be much more preferable if there's a permanent understanding of parity payments in all of these areas, including HIV, and that then is on a regular basis and not a one-off, but it's clearly identified that payment is being provided to each of the UK nations.
And then in terms of all other aspects of funding of the WIBS scheme, so if we leave aside the direct payment from DHSC in relation to an HIV element, that is funded out of the Welsh Government's general health budget, is it?
Correct.
And there are no specific sums allocated by the UK Government to the Welsh Government specifically in respect of financial support, leaving aside the HIV payments?
No, so when when the transfer was made and responsibility was devolved, there wasn't an ongoing commitment to change the money if there were increases made in each of the schemes. So the additional sums we found have come from the health budget.
If we can just pick up one of the observations made in the survey that was undertaken before the WIB scheme was set up. It's at WITN 5665002, please, Shamek. So we can see here, Welsh Government Survey, summary of responses, reform of support for those affected by NHS-supplied contaminated blood. The date, if we look at the bottom of the page, is the 30th of March 2017. If we go to the fourth page, so there are a number of themes which you've already referred to and which you explained in your March 2017 statement were then picked up in the design of the scheme. But there's one particular point I wanted to ask you about here. So if we look at question 3, the observation, third bullet point down, lifetime guarantee for all scheme recipients, not dependent on which government is in power. Do you understand and accept that for beneficiaries, the absence of any kind of long-term commitment, guarantee, assurance may significantly increase their suffering, distress and anxiety, or hinder their ability to make life decisions?
Yes, I understand that. I understand that without a clear commitment that the scheme will carry on for the life of the beneficiaries, that obviously affects the way that people make life plans. I understand that completely. It's a point that I completely understand, and I'm not surprised came up in the consultation that we ran.
And to what extent is the Welsh Government able to give any kind of commitment or assurance or reassurance that payments will be made for the lifetime of the recipients?
Well, we've agreed now, particularly with the movement on parity, we've agreed a scheme, and as clear a commitment as this government can give, that scheme will continue for the future. There's no end date to that scheme. I've said several times, the reality is that each year there are fewer people who are still with us, and so I expect the scheme to continue through its lifetime. The challenge is that there are elections every year, every term, and the new government may have a different view, and trying to have a legal guarantee, I think, is difficult, but a clear commitment, and as clear a commitment as I think you can get from Wales, because within our Senedd, I've referred previously in the statements you've highlighted, the discussions that are taking place within the chamber, and people in all parties want to see a settlement for the future, so there's a significant cross-party desire to see a settlement that is long-term and not simply something that works on a year-to-year basis. And that's certainly the position of this government.
So I note the time. I've still got a number of questions to ask, so perhaps this would be a convenient moment for a break.
Yes, well, we'll take a break until 11:45. This allows anyone who wishes, who's watching, to have some refreshment if they wish, have a break. The same applies to you as it does to us. But there's one thing which I must say to you, as I say to all witnesses. You're giving evidence. You must not talk to anyone about the answers you have given or the answers which you expect you may be asked to give in the rest of your evidence. You can talk about anything else you like. I look forward to seeing you back at 11:45.
Thank you, Sir Brian.